I figured it was only fair, in the bulletin every time Marty puts one of these up. So I thought turnabout was fair play. The sermon I actually want to preach today, and she got kind of close, is on identity. And I want to talk a little bit today about identity, but first I sort of want to tell a story. So a story about we got to go back one, sorry. Oh. You're welcome. So, the story goes something like this. My favorite movie, if you can sort of make this out, is a movie called Zulu. Now, if you haven't seen this, it's really old. It's a really old movie. It's like 1962 or something. It's Michael Caine's first movie, and he looks really young. The story is about a war nobody remembers. In the 1870s, the British noticed that their colony in South Africa didn't have any gold, and they decided to go north and take some gold from the Zulu territory that was a little farther north. They didn't plan this very well, and they got wiped out to a man. This was not, however, what the movie Zulu is about. The movie Zulu is actually about a little contingent of Welsh soldiers who got left behind at a place called Rorke's Drift. And Rorke's Drift was essentially a farm surrounded by hills, and they were there to build a bridge for like the inevitable gold rush that was supposed to follow the British victory. Well, it turns out, since the British were wiped out, they got news a day later that the entire Zulu army was coming down the road towards them, and they were in real trouble. Some of the men were wounded, and they thought, if we put everybody on carts, we'll just get killed on the road. So they decided to basically hold out at this little farm, and they built battlements around the farm, and then they built a redoubt in the middle out of meal bags, and they waited for the onslaught. And they were outnumbered 100 to 1 or more, and they're basically in this little indefensible farm, and the Zulus show up. And the movie is about that battle, the Battle of Rorke's Drift. Now, the thing about the movie is that it's very cleverly done because you're not sure who you're rooting for. The British are there to steal gold and take somebody else's land, but they're heavily outnumbered. The Zulus are sort of the odds-on favorite, but it is kind of their country. And so you really have this ambiguous feeling, and you watch the movie, and the Welsh aren't all that sympathetic. And each progressive fight, the Welsh get pushed closer and closer into the redoubt. Until the last climactic scene, the remaining Welshmen are in this little circle of meal bags, and they're waiting for the attack. Now, I should pause this to explain why this isn't a sermon on identity. My dad's family is Norwegian. And they're very proud of this fact. Christmas flags on the Christmas tree, lutefisk at holidays, right? They were really, really Norwegian. I think the first person in the family to marry somebody who wasn't of Norwegian heritage was my dad. It turns out he married my mom, who's Welsh. But the Welsh side of the family, they were coal miners. They came over at the end of the 19th century. They just didn't really care all that much about Wales. That was just where they were from. They were coal miners. You could be coal miners in Ohio. You could be coal miners in Wales. And so when they got there, they didn't have a lot of traditions or make a lot about they were Welsh. But when you would go and visit them, you would notice something really different. They sang grace at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. And not just singing grace, they sang grace in multiple part harmony with everybody knowing parts they had sung forever, pitch perfect, beautifully. It was awe-inspiring. It turns out the Welsh do this all the time. They sing hymns at rugby games. We once went to a Paul McCartney concert in Cardiff, and it was basically a 6-hour music festival in which the audience sang more or less perfectly every Beatles song you can think of. It's kind of amazing how gifted musically the Welsh are. So we return to the Battle of Rorke's Drift, and at this point, the commander turns to one of the men in this redoubt, and he realizes that they're in trouble. And the Zulus have begun singing and beating their shields, and there's thousands of them surrounding this little redoubt. And they know they're in trouble, and the men are looking nervous as the Zulus chant. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, but you've seen the Twin Towers, apparently Peter Jackson just stole the entire movie Zulu for the Battle of Helm's Deep, so you've seen it only with orcs rather than Zulus. So, the commander turns to his second in command, who's also Welsh, and he says, "What do you think of that, Owen?" And of course the guy's name is Owen because he's Welsh. And Owen turns to me and goes, "Oh, sir, they've got a good bass section, but no top tenors." And he begins to sing. And he sings the song, The Men of Hawick. Men of Hawick, stop your dreaming. Can't you see their spear points gleaming? We shall never be caught dreaming. Welshmen do not yield. Okay, suddenly I've got a side. I'm up from the couch. I'm ready. I'm there. I'm Welsh. Welshmen don't yield. Go Wales! Okay, I just got through telling you I'm not really Welsh. But for that moment, in that time, boy, I want to be on the side of the plucky Welshmen because they don't yield. Here's the funny thing about identity, folks. There's so many examples of that, where suddenly we have an affinity with people from the narrowest, smallest thing. We live in an age of identity. We talk about identity politics. We've reached a state where more people would be upset if their child married someone from another political party than married someone of a different race, which is kind of progress, if you think about it, but not really, right? We are people of identity at the moment. We think this is new, but it's not. It just had a different name. It was called tribalism. And Paul, as with so many things, was there way, way before us. I want to submit to you that the book of Galatians is a book about identity, all about identity. That the story of Galatians is the story of Paul reaching out to us and saying, how do you handle identity? And I'm going to submit this as my thesis this morning. We have lived in a pretty homogeneous country, most of us that are my age or older. The places we came from, people were like us. And so when they came to church, the issue of identity wasn't all that important to us. We don't live in that world anymore. And we're not going to live in it for a long time. And so we as Christians need to think a lot about what identity means as Christians and how we respond. Because when we invite the world in, the world now doesn't look like us. It doesn't think like us. It's not us, right? It's not our identity. And we need to be prepared to ask ourselves, how do we relate to that? And nicely, Paul has given this some thought. So, please advance. Save me, small Cagley. There we go. Okay. So, this is the passage from Galatians that we all know really well. It's a really beautiful passage, and I want to set the stage for Galatians because I think there's two things about Galatians we really want to know. The first thing about Galatians is that Paul was writing to churches kind of in Asia Minor, and these churches had fellowship across Jews and Gentiles. And something has happened to pull that fellowship apart. The second thing we need to know, and I think this is equally important, Corinth was a mess. But after Paul's death, within 100 years, we start getting references in these early church letters to Corinth. We don't get a lot of references to these churches in Galatia. So whatever happened here, it was extremely destructive, and we want to pay attention to it. So here's what Paul writes to the churches in Galatia. He says, "So in Christ you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized in Christ have clothed yourself with Christ." And this is the one that we all know. "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and his heir according to the promise." So Paul is saying something. Now, I want to unpack because I think we interpret this as saying, okay, you have a new identity. You're Christians now. But I don't think that's what Paul's saying. I think Paul is saying something much deeper, right? He's saying, in effect, the world's not going to let you forget an identity it assigns to you. That's going to be true out there. The question is, how do we respond to that in here? And the answer, in short, and I'll come back to this again, is every person is a child of God, regardless of their identity. Every person is a child of God, regardless of their identity. This is, because look, I think we dismiss Peter too quickly on this one, right? We're used to Peter being the guy who kind of makes the mistake and then gets it right eventually. But let's see this from Peter's perspective. What are the two issues? Circumcision, right? And number two, right, circumcision, and number two is eating meat sacrificed to idols. We think about that and we go, well, that's crazy. Why is that such a big deal, right? But here's the thing. If you were a Greek, particularly a Greek man, and this is going to sound a little funny, you did a lot of things naked. You bathed in public baths. You went to the gymnasium and exercised. All of this was done naked. This was the social life of the city. If you did what the faction of James is requiring of you, you stood out. Jews didn't participate in that. They believed they should not be naked, so they didn't go to the baths. They didn't participate in athletic events. So Peter is basically being called out on this, right? So here's my first point. Your identity, you choose or others. Look, I think we live in a world where we have so much freedom that we think I get to choose my identity. Marty made this point, hence my first slide, last time, and it's absolutely right. That was not the world of the first century, right? I'm not so sure it's our world, right? I'm not actually convinced that we get to choose our identity as much as we thought. So here's Paul's quote to Cephas. Cephas is Peter. It says, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy." Put yourself in Barnabas and Peter's shoes for a minute. They're Jews, right? Paul himself says this. I'm a Jew. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. Everything you Hebrews think is important, that's me. But it's also his tribe. These are the people who are going to stand by you. These are the people you rely on in this world. Others are going to see you in this context as Jewish, whether you want to identify that way or not. You're the Jew, right? And so what he's saying is, what the James faction is saying is, look, if Gentiles want to join us, we know what they have to do. They got to be circumcised. They got to stop eating meat sacrificed to idols. They can join our identity, but they can't keep their own. They've got to break that, right? And Paul says, Peter, that's hypocrisy. You know, you've had visions. Jesus told you. You know that isn't important. That's about who you are, not about people being children of God. When I was in graduate school, I had an experience that sort of has stuck with me. There were two guys from Africa in my graduate school. One of them was from Burundi. The other one was actually my office mate. And we were sitting around at lunch one time, and the one from Burundi, a really tall, slender guy, long arms and legs, he said, "Isn't it funny that the two guys that look alike got put in the same office?" Now, I got to tell you, I grew up in Iowa and central Missouri. There were three races, black, white, and foreign exchange student, right? That was it. There were no others, right? And it just made no sense to me that the guy from Burundi was looking at my office mate, who was also African, and going, "Oh, look, those two guys look alike." Except we do. We were short, stocky little guys, right? It was the two short, stocky guys in the department that had been put in the same office. Here's the thing. 3 years later, that friend of mine from Burundi, his entire family, and 1 million other people in the Lakes region were slaughtered because they were Tutsis in the Rwandan genocide. The picture behind me is a memorial in Rwanda to that genocide, and the thing you'll notice is those are machetes. Why were 1 million people hacked to death? Because what identified identity in Rwanda was the length of your arms and legs, and the machetes were to cut them off. I often wonder if my friend had a Liam Neeson moment with me, where he sort of looked at me and thought, "You look like the people that slaughtered all these people in my family." Because, of course, that wasn't my identity. I didn't pick that, right? To me, short, stocky did not equal another identity. It just equaled the short, stocky Norwegian, right? My point is, you don't get to choose these identities. The world out there, it's going to assign these identities to you, whether you like them or not. And the question is, what do we do about them here, right? How do we respond to those identities that people are given? Here's a second problem. Now, the purity tests I'm talking about are not the ones you're thinking of. But here's the problem. My mother-in-law was an otherwise intelligent woman who you could turn her defenses off by saying you were a Christian. It was really, if you're selling her something and you could work into the conversation, "I'm a Christian," she stopped negotiating because a Christian couldn't possibly take advantage of her. If somebody asked her for money and said they were a Christian, she would give it. Now, I say this is interesting because this was not a problem Paul faced. There was no Christian identity, right? But I think one of the solutions that's really tempting is to say, okay, if the world classifies us, let's just pick a new identity. We will be Christians. Christian is an identity. That's my identity right now. I'm picking that one, right? I think the issue with that, quite simply, right, is, and it comes out in this, is this how we see Christians? Now, on one side we have a Dave, a level 17 Christian, missionary, raised in the church, husband of one wife who teaches at a Christian college. On the other side, we have Eric, maybe a level 5 at best, right? Like, not nearly. If you think about this, how often do we do this with Christian identity? I've got this, right? This person checks all of these boxes that Christians are supposed to check, right? More Christian, less Christian, right? Paul's saying it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way, right? And the problem is if we do, we get into purity tests where, trust Dave more than you trust me. Why? He's a better Christian. There aren't better Christians, Paul says, right? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There's no level 17 Christians. I do stand by chaotic good, though. Have you seen his posts? Thank you, yeah. This comes from something called the Didache. The Didache was a manual on how to be a Christian. It was written about 100 AD, about shortly after the oldest books that we have in our New Testament. And the Didache was basically a how-to guide. But I like this one. This is basically how you deal with other Christians. And my thought is, by the time the Didache is written, it's not Greek versus Jew anymore. There's another group, and those other groups are Christians. And the thing they're struggling with is Christian identity. And they say, look, the reception of Christians, but receive everyone who comes in the name of the Lord and prove and know him afterwards. For you shall have understanding of right and left. If he comes to you as a wayfarer, assist him as you are able. But he shall remain with you no more than 2 or 3 days, if need be. But if he wants to stay with you and is an artisan, let him work and eat. But if he has no trade according to your understanding, see to it that as a Christian, he shall not live with you idle. But if he wills to do so, he's a Christmonger. I like the Christmonger part. It's basically saying, look, this is somebody selling Jesus in order to get something from you. Be suspicious. You see, I think there's a danger in this identity, right? Because it basically makes it a wall. There's us, the people who have the identity. There's them outside. But here's the thing, folks. The test is not supposed to be very high. That's the whole point, right? The test is not supposed to be very high. And so when people come in, right, it's relatively easy for our identity to be malleable. It's not really an identity. Okay. Well, maybe we could just all get along. Maybe one solution to this is just pluralism of identities. If it works out there, maybe it works in here. So we just say, okay, all of the identities that come in from outside, we'll just make sure that we can all get along. If you know where this quote is from, you know what's next. It's Rodney King after the riots in 1994. So I think we're pretty safe on saying the answer to that is no. That doesn't work. It doesn't work in here, right? Why? Because those conflicts are inevitable. Paul is saying to us, look, you have a solution here, and it's not to keep thinking of yourselves as identities. It's to keep thinking of people as child of God, as an individual, as a person, right? Paul's saying, you can't keep those, Peter. You can't hang on to those identity. We can't just get along. Some conflict will come between us. So what's his solution? For brothers and sisters, you were called to be free. Do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh, but rather serve one humbly in love, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Every person you encounter is a child of God. Now, let me pause for a second and say this. I think there's an answer to this, right, that when people object, and they say, well, look, that identity did something to me, right? Your gender didn't let my gender vote until 1990, right? Your race owned my race, right? There's a conflict here, right, between our identities, and it matters, right? There's injustice going on, and I don't want to just treat this person as a child of God because I have a grievance. I have an anger. I am, and look, there are Christians with righteous reasons to be angry at other people. And Paul is saying, don't do that. Is Paul an idiot? This is the guy who wrote Philemon. Think about what Philemon's about. Philemon is a letter from Paul to a slaveholder on behalf of an escaped slave. The key thing about Philemon, Paul could have written a treatise saying, Philemon, slavery is wrong. You don't own another human being. That's unchristian. He could have written that. Do we think Paul was pro-slavery? It doesn't make any sense. Everything Paul writes is about people as children of God. Of course Paul was against slavery. But what Paul actually says is, Philemon, you're a child of God. Onesimus is a child of God. You have every right to do whatever masters do to slaves under the law. But you shouldn't do that. You should approach him as a child of God. Paul understood about suffering and persecution, and he understood about righteous anger. But he's telling us a way forward in a world that's fragmented, which is you need to make this about the other person, the individual in front of you. And that person, not as an example of an identity, right, but as a child of God. Or as he puts it in the man's own words, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. Or maybe, and I like this one a little better in Philippians, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but rather in humility value one another above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. I say this because I think this is going to be a struggle for us as a fellowship, as Christians, right? Not just us, the Sunny Hills Church of Christ, but us as Christians in the modern United States. And the fact of the matter is, if this becomes our identity, it is in opposition to something else. Paul knew that. And when he said to Peter, you have to fellowship with people, right? You have to fellowship with people that are not of your tribe. You've got to reach out to them as children of God. You've got to embrace them. That was the way forward. Because he could have easily written in Galatians as saying, hey, we're all Christians now. Circle the gates. Everybody's one. You've got a new identity. Don't give up on that. But that isn't what he said. He said everyone is a child of God. So I leave you with this sort of last thought. My last thought is this. When the world wanders into our fellowship, because this is hard, folks. It's really hard. Can we look at people as children of God? Or do we live in a society where our first thought is to think of them as some group, as some bin, some identity? If we can get past that initial putting people in bins, as we get to know people, I think that identity matters a lot less. Right? The world may not join us in that attempt, but in here, that's the way forward. Thank you.